All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 25, Section 3, The Challenge of Social and Economic Change. So we're focusing in this chapter primarily on the Americas. And in terms of social and economic change, most of this is related to, on the one hand, social, to the political revolutions. And in the previous chapter, we talked really about how governments were created in both North and South America and some of the problems that those governments had in maintaining order. When you think about social, think about society. Remember, the political revolutions unleashed some pretty powerful ideas. And so the question is, well, how do those ideas then kind of challenge the society in the Americas? With economic change, of course, we're talking about industrialization. And again, in this specific section in this chapter, we're going to say some things broadly about the Americas in general. One that was pretty common throughout both in North and South America was the challenge to slavery. Now, recall when it came to the political revolutions that it was only in certain areas in which slavery was abolished. For a very brief time, it was abolished in France, right? Briefly. But then the Haitian Revolution, where slave revolt turned an independence movement, led to the abolition there. But for most of the Americas, slavery endured beyond the political revolutions. That includes countries like the United States. It includes countries like Brazil. While there were some nations that did move to abolishing slavery, Mexico, for example, during their revolution, there were others in which newly independent nations were created, yet the institution of slavery remained the same. And so those who wanted to eradicate slavery, not just in the Americas, but that's where it was the most prevalent at the time, were known as abolitionists. So the abolitionists were people who worked to eliminate slavery. And the abolitionists were rich, they were poor, they were men, they were women. They organized voluntarily, oftentimes creating various campaigns, like creating letters in the mail to go and convince people that slavery is something that needed to be eradicated. And there was some progress on this issue as a result of the political revolution. So, for example, in the United States, the northern American states moved to gradually abolished slavery after 1776, which was the American Revolution. It was the southern states that continued to make it legal and continued to expand it. While slavery remained legal in places like the southern United States and places like the Caribbean and places like Brazil, many nations actively ought to ban the slave trade, that is the importation of slaves from Africa. So, for example, when it came to actually banning importing more slaves, Great Britain did it in 1807. The United States did it in 1808. And especially for the British, because they had the most powerful navy in the world at the time, which meant that they could actually enforce it. So for the most part, the slave trade really began to diminish. That is, the importation of Africans to the New World began to diminish starting in the 1800s. However, slavery itself continued to thrive and exist in the Western Hemisphere. And the way that the abolitionists really tackled the issue of slavery was on these two principles here. On the one hand, there was the idea of Christian morality. You might think of Christian morality as, the idea that everybody is equal before God. In some sense, there is a certain spiritual equality to the Christian message, and many of the abolitionists embrace Christianity to do that. But also this appeal to universal rights, and that's really what ties back to the political revolutions. This was the contradiction, on the one hand, of somebody like Thomas Jefferson saying all men are created equal, but on the other hand, so many of those who were involved in these revolutionary movements were slave owners themselves. With the creation of these new governments, women and African Americans were almost excluded or not almost, but I should say, were excluded from political power, at least in the case of the United States. And some of them turned towards social movements, excluded from, again, the political process, turned towards social movements in order to try and get change to happen. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, one of the most popular and well-known abolitionists, he was a former slave, black man, and an abolitionist. And he was somebody who promoted for the eradication of slavery in the United States and abroad. As far as the United States goes, really what kind of got the ball rolling was the U.S. Civil War, which was fought 1861 to 1865. Now, the abolitionists have already been pretty loud in the United States up until that time. The U.S. had officially or legally banned the slave trade in 1808. Northern U.S. states had gotten rid of slavery. The question of slavery in the United States really played out over Western territories as to whether or not Western territories should have slavery legal. Finally, that came to a conflict, you might say, when Abraham Lincoln, a staunch opponent of expanding slavery, was elected. The southern states seceded, and during that war, which was North versus South, and for the most part was the free states versus the slave states, not exclusively though, the North won. And it was during that war that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery in southern states. He did this during the war, and having declared the end of slavery within the entire United States, it became a matter of whether the North would be victorious. The North did win, and therefore slavery was abolished in the U.S. by 1865. The 13th Amendment made that not just a proclamation by the president, but rather made it a constitutional amendment written right into the rule book. Following emancipation, though, African Americans in the U.S. faced discrimination. Jim Crow laws segregated, and segregated means to separate white and black populations. And the fight for civil rights, especially in the southern states where these Jim Crow laws applied, would continue on for the next century or so. In the case of Brazil, another country that was rather late to abolish slavery, you might say, or a country that slavery persisted beyond the political revolutions at the time. The Brazilian monarch Pedro II wanted slavery at the very least challenged. But many of the economic interests in Brazil didn't permit it. During the War of the Triple Alliance, many slaves, this was a war between Brazil and Paraguay, among other nations. Many slaves fought for their freedom. Slaves were allowed to enlist in the Brazilian army, and in doing so, became free in the aftermath. This put a lot of pressure on Brazil. And finally, slavery was abolished formally in Brazil in 1888. So 1865 for the US, 1888 for Brazil. In the Caribbean, it really depended. So for example, one of the first places slavery was abolished was in Haiti, right? We talked about the Haitian Revolution, which established an independent country in 1804. That really provided some, what you might say, like motivation and inspiration to a lot of the other slave societies in the Caribbean. One thing that was different in the Caribbean was that there was really no abolitionist movement there because the free white population was so small compared to the enslaved black population. Spanish Cuba was one of the last Caribbean islands to move towards the abolition of slavery. In Spanish Cuba, it came formally in 1886, kind of right up there with Brazil. In terms of European countries, now recall the British, the French, and the Dutch, for the most part, they had lost many of their American colonies, so it wasn't really a matter of when Great Britain was to abolish slavery, because the colonies which consisted of the most slaves, the United States, were independent. The same thing with France. France didn't really have large-scale plantations. In the case of Haiti, they did, but they lost Haiti in 1804. And so some of these European nations eradicated slavery a little bit earlier. So, for example, the British, formally in 1838, one of the very first countries to do it. France and, in fact, a lot of other European nations did it in 1848 as part of the revolutions of 1848. The Dutch a little bit later in the 1860s. And one colony in which the Dutch had to kind of take this into consideration outside of the Americas, in fact, was Indonesia, which the Dutch had a presence there. But the British, the French, and the Dutch all had somewhat of a presence in the Caribbean. And so the British in 1838, one of the first countries to abolish slavery, France and many other European countries, 1848, and lastly, the Dutch in Indonesia and other areas. One characteristic about the Americas, really in the 19th century, the 1800s, was heavy immigration. Now, for the most part, from about 1500 to, we'll say 1800 or so, most people that came to the Americas were enslaved Africans. That changed after 1800. The diminish of the slave trade following the British prohibiting it, and then later on the United States, along with better forms of technology, allowed for more immigrants. Specifically, Europeans and Asians traveled really much en masse to the New World. This led to some backlash in various countries. So, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, this was a U.S. law against Chinese immigration. Essentially prohibiting it, limiting it, and then prohibiting it. The head tax, this was a way that Canada discouraged immigration. So, tax to discourage it. Immigration. I think it's with an I, immigration. And interestingly enough, pretty much via Great Britain, a lot of people from India or Indian immigrants ended up in the Caribbean, almost 1 million in this particular time period. So lots of different Europeans, lots of different Asians, people from India, even moving to places like the Caribbean islands. The effect that this had on culture was something that we call acculturation. This is maybe the blending or changing of culture. So, big culture groups like Italians, Jews, Chinese, India, when they arrived in the New World, there was a lot more variety in the different types of cultures. We're talking about things like languages, food, song, those sorts of things, music, all of those things changed as a result of this immigration. Meanwhile, while the fight for or the abolitionist movement occupied a good part of reform movements, there were also other reform movements that targeted specifically women's rights and what we might call social justice. In terms of women's rights, the first and major convention on women's rights was the Seneca Falls Convention. This was held in New York. Essentially, what has happened was that women being excluded from the political process joined up various reform movements. In this case, women couldn't vote in the United States at this time, but they could still be abolitionists. And many of these like-minded women who were involved in these public efforts, whether it was to get rid of slavery, get rid of alcohol, get rid of prostitution, came together for this greater cause, in a sense, and that was the cause for women's rights. At this convention, you had major leaders of the women's rights movement meet, create a manifesto that was based off of, so you might say based off of the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal. The women at Seneca Falls said all men and women are created equal, and made it clear that equality was suffrage, and that was the right to vote. In other words, women would not be or would not achieve equality until that moment was met. Segregation also faced opponents. So, for example, even though slavery was abolished in many American countries, there were still laws on the books that treated people of African descent as second-class citizens. So the effort to try and get rid of segregation, this is also what we call in the U.S. Jim Crow laws, was also very prevalent. One difference between the United States and Latin America was that in the US, there was a much starker color line. That is to say, in the US, it was black or white, whereas in Latin American countries, there was still discrimination, but it was more gradual. There tended to be a gradient, maybe, of discrimination rather than sort of this clear color line that existed within the United States. Economically speaking, the development and underdevelopment of the Americas really tied a lot of these nations to the global economy. And what we mean by this, so development, this is a term that we use to describe the industrial nations. And among the industrial nations, the United States was the most prevalent, but also Canada and Argentina, to a lesser degree, would be considered in maybe this development category, although industry there was a little bit less prevalent. We might add, at least these were wealthy nations. However, most of the Americas remained in this kind of area of underdevelopment, which instead of producing industrial goods, pretty much continued to create raw materials. And that was kind of we might say, also developed a dependency, right, for this. And so in terms of the underdeveloped nations, we're going to look at Latin America, most of Latin America. We're also going to put the southern United States, right? So think about the Cotton Belt. The southern part of the United States, like Alabama, like Texas, remained relatively underdeveloped as well. One thing that made this possible were new technologies, railroads, telegraph, steamship. So we might say made economic integration possible. And economic integration just simply means the ability for the Americas to trade and buy and sell with the rest of the world. With railroads, telegraphs, and steamships, it was possible, for example, to take cattle from Texas, put it on a train to Chicago, process it into a steak, throw it on a steamship, and sell it to like London or something like that. So the world became very much connected together. Now, when it came to building these technologies and this infrastructure, it was primarily European and American owned. This was even the case in both North America and South America. So for example, take a country like Mexico. During the early 1900s, it would be true that like over half the land of Mexico was owned by outside American businesses, or all the telegraphs in Central America were owned by Europeans or Americans. So a lot of the infrastructure was owned by European businesses, owned by American businesses, and that's why they fall into this category of developed, the more industrial nations. Now, in Latin America, the southern United States, why did these remain relatively underdeveloped? Well, on the one hand, agricultural and mining exports were profitable in the short run, right? Coffee, sugar, all these things can continue to make a lot of money. But the problem was that with a lot of the agricultural and mining exports, again, it creates this system of dependency where those materials are going then to outside countries, which then turn them into finished goods. At the same time, foreign goods flooded in at a cheap price, leaving industries in Latin America unable to compete. And lastly, political instability, things like civil war, constant regime change, for example, the fact that in many Latin American nations, it was unknown as to whether or not a republic could quickly diminish and fall into dictatorship, which happened in a lot of these countries. All of these things were kind of a recipe, you might say, for an underdeveloped economy and dependent economy in mostly Latin America. The last thing we'll talk about this is the impact on the environment. All of these things, rapid population growth, especially in the cities, right? Urbanization was characteristic of this time period, 1800 to 1890. Expansion across the West, various new forms of technology, plants, animals, all of these things led to environmental damage. And in some areas, there were efforts to conserve the environment. So for example, Theodore Roosevelt, US president, sought to conserve land. And in this picture here, we just have the US, but we can get kind of an example of just how quick and rapid some of this resource extraction was and the altering of the environment. Take, for example, something like mining. Take, for example, something like, the timber or lumber, cutting down forests. This map is showing here in 1870, all the red railroads were where the U.S. was connected. By 1920, all the green railroads. So all of the forests in these areas would be cut down for timber. The forests up here would be cut down for timber. Everything in the Southwest would be blown up for mining. A little bit later on in Texas and Oklahoma, that would be oil or petroleum country. So and again, all these things being integrated into the global economy, creating a rising standard of living, at least material standard of living for people all around the world, but at the same time putting a lot of pressure on the environment in the Americas.